It started at a rooftop dinner we almost didn't attend. I'm an IT architect. My job is to find weaknesses in complex systems. That week, I'd closed a deal that landed me a six-figure bonus. My first thought was to celebrate with her, maybe finally book that trip to Italy she'd been dreaming about. But she insisted we go to this party. "You need to stop hiding behind work," she'd said, looping her arm through mine with that easy smile she used to mask a command as concern. The wine was cheap, but the sunset helped. Mutual friends circled until he showed up. Mark, the kind of man who didn't speak so much as audition. He leaned in too close to her, too familiar. I didn't make a scene. I never do. I just let my hand rest on her lower back. A quiet claim. She didn't lean into it. Later, I caught a thread of conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. "You're so jealous of him. It's kind of insecure," she said. Her eyes locked on me. It came dressed as a joke, designed to get laughs from her friends. It did, but not from me. I didn't answer. I just smiled, which I know unnerves her more than anything. But she wasn't done. "Maybe I'll crash at his place tonight, just to prove it's harmless." That landed like a pin dropped on marble. The laughter came slower this time, uncertain. A couple of glances darted in my direction, then away. She held the moment a little too long. Her lips curled just enough to blur the line between teasing and testing. I didn't blink. I didn't ask if she meant it. I took a sip of wine, nodded once, and said nothing. That silence gave her no fuel, no reaction, just an open space for her own words to echo. We left separately. She claimed she was staying for another round. I didn't argue. On the drive home, I gripped the wheel, not with anger, but with focus. Her words weren't a misstep. They were a social penetration test, pushing boundaries to see what would break. It wasn't about Mark. It was about leverage, her need to prove she could install any backdoor into our marriage she wanted, and I just have to accept the vulnerability. I didn't sleep that night. I wasn't pacing or unraveling. I was designing a new system architecture, a secure one. She thought she dropped a logic bomb designed to crash my system. What she didn't understand is that for an IT architect, a catastrophic failure isn't the end. It's the perfect reason to build something new from the ground up, with much, much better firewalls. The map of what came next wasn't about revenge. It was my disaster recovery plan. By morning, I had my first data point. Her shared location, a system we'd used for years, not out of distrust, but for logistical efficiency, went dark just after midnight. A deliberate severing of a node. I ran the diagnostic twice. Confirmed. It wasn't a glitch. It was a manual override. Conclusions weren't my goal. I was gathering threat intelligence. She didn't come home. No message, no call, just a firewall of silence. Then, at 9:30, the next data point appeared. Not from her, but from a low-priority contact in her social network. One of those friends who tags everyone in everything. A blurry photo. Soft morning light. Her, curled up on a sectional couch I didn't recognize. Her sleeves swallowed by a large gray hoodie. Mark's hoodie. The caption read, "Too tired to go home." I analyzed it for a full minute. This wasn't a confession. It was a carefully staged piece of social engineering, calculated to be technically defensible. Wade just slept on the couch. But emotionally devastating. She wasn't cheating. She was demonstrating a security breach, proving she could grant anyone access she wanted. The hoodie was the payload. She knew exactly how that file would execute in my head. I didn't comment. I didn't react. I screenshotted the image, encrypted it, and moved it to a secure private cloud folder I had just created. Then I began phase 1 of my plan, containment. We had a shared calendar entry for a friend's engagement party that weekend. I declined the invitation, citing a conflict. I then canceled a dinner party she had insisted we host. When she finally texted later that afternoon, long night, LOL. What's the plan for dinner? I waited 4 hours, letting the packets time out, before replying, already ate. No emotion, no sarcasm. Just a clean, logical response that signaled a system change. That night, I made her favorite pasta, ate in silence, cleaned up with methodical precision. She came home late, smelling of cheap beer and unfamiliar cologne, her eyes scanning me for a vulnerability, an emotional port she could exploit. Anger, maybe. Disappointment. I gave her a closed interface. Rough night? She asked, probing for an entry point. Long day, I said, closing the connection. I could feel her watching me, assuming my silence was a system shutdown, a crash. She didn't understand. I had already stepped outside the flawed architecture of the life we'd built, and I was quietly, methodically revoking her access privileges, one by one. Over the next few days, I executed a protocol of strategic disengagement. I became a system she no longer had the credentials to access. No dramatic outbursts, no accusations. My method was quieter. I simply let the silence grow teeth. I stopped initiating contact. Her messages, logistics, memes that once served as API calls for affection now received delayed, throttled responses. My tone was polite, professional, the kind of neutral language used in a service-level agreement. It unnerved her. I began revoking our shared social permissions. Mutual friends dinner, request timed out. Game night with her college crew, access denied due to a scheduling conflict. I never specified the conflict. She didn't confront me at first. She assumed I was running in safe mode, expecting her to initiate a messy, performative reboot. But when no such reboot came, I saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes, the look of a user who doesn't understand why their commands are no longer working. She tried to reassert control through legacy systems. Sticky notes on the fridge. Don't forget Sunday. A light hand on my arm. She was trying to anchor our relationship with the muscle memory of habit, but the core programming had already been severed. I didn't flinch. I just kept walking. She began her own counter-strategy, a propaganda campaign. You know, men really need to unlearn control, she said one morning, her tone light, her eyes locked on mine. She was trying to preemptively frame my withdrawal as a control issue. Another time, she remarked, it's wild how many women feel safer around male friends than their own partners. No context. Just deploying packets of psychological warfare, hoping for a reaction. I gave her none. Meanwhile, my own strategy escalated. I began migrating our shared digital infrastructure. Shared calendars were unlinked. Two-factor authentication on travel and booking platforms was rerouted to my devices. These weren't financial assets yet, but the support systems she relied on, the ones built on my architecture. The changes were silent, subtle, and entirely within my administrative rights. She didn't notice the ground shifting beneath her, because unlike me, she had never bothered to read the system documentation. Her tone changed, not to softness, but to something sharper, defensive. At one of the few dinners I still attended for optics, she tried to force a system crash. When I mentioned I hadn't kept up with a show we used to watch, she jumped in. He probably doesn't have time for anything except performance reviews and self-righteousness, she said, smiling too wide. No one laughed. The network rejected the packet. I looked at her calmly. You've been catching up without me? A micro flinch, a packet loss. She shrugged. It's just TV. But the mask cracked. In the car, she braced for a fight, for the shouting match that would validate her narrative of me being unstable. I gave her silence. Let her sit with the weight of her own failed execution. Back home, I poured a drink, sat at my desk, and began the audit. I opened the shared files for a business initiative we'd once flirted with co-launching project outlines, client notes, strategy documents. Her name was everywhere, listed as a co-founder on pitches I had written, a partner on accounts I had secured. I began methodically scrubbing her from the architecture. It wasn't an emotional act of deletion. It was a security update. Her name was a vulnerability, a user with too many permissions and no accountability. I started by removing her from future pitches, a simple change she wouldn't notice immediately. But I was just warming up. A few days later, she started her counter moves, disappearing for hangouts, refusing to give names or details. She'd leave wearing clothes that were more curated than casual and return not looking guilty but triumphant, as if daring me to ask where she'd been. I didn't take the bait. The moment she walked out the door, I executed my own protocol. I logged into a shared cloud storage account we'd had for years. It was our digital attic, filled with old photos, tax documents, and project drafts not important enough to be heavily guarded, but a goldmine of information. I changed the master password, updated the recovery email and phone number to my own, and enabled multi-factor authentication. Then I began migrating terabytes of data to a new private encrypted server. It was the digital equivalent of packing a go bag, and she didn't even know the house was on fire. The emotional temperature in the house dropped below freezing. Evenings were quiet, but not peaceful. She'd play music in the kitchen, one of those nostalgic playlists she used to build for us. It sounded like static now, a corrupted file from a system that was no longer supported. I noticed her phone was always tilted away, her screen angled from my view. I saw the calculated size as she passed me in the hallway. She was beginning to deploy the victim narrative, not to me yet, but to her network. The first ping came from her friend, Laura. "Hey, is everything okay between you two? She's been different." I kept my tone steady, giving a generic corporate response. "We've both been busy. I'm sure we'll figure things out." I offered no data, no vulnerability. Laura wanted more, but the firewall was up. The call wasn't about Laura, though. It was a diagnostic test. It confirmed my suspicion. She was actively running a smear campaign, painting me as the source of the problem. Mark wasn't the issue. He was just the tool she'd used. The real malware was her need to constantly test boundaries, and I had finally stopped patching the exploits she created. The unraveling began in the spaces just outside her control. Laura was only the first. By the end of the week, I received 2 more pings from mutual acquaintances. One, a former coworker, called under the guise of catching up, then carefully pivoted. "She's been saying some confusing stuff," he said. "Not sure what's going on, but it doesn't sound like you." I didn't ask for details. I just thanked him for the call. But after we hung up, I opened a new file. Project, Narwhal, log. I logged the call, the timestamp, and the key phrases. She was positioning herself as misunderstood, stifled, brave for challenging norms. She wanted to be seen, not as someone fraying a bond, but as someone pushing for evolution. It was all theater, a fork of an old, tired script. Mark, the pawn in her game, kept appearing in system logs. She stopped mentioning him directly, which was a clear indicator he was still in the picture. If he were truly gone, she'd be loudly performative about it. Instead, his name came up only through other channels. A friend of mine, one who doesn't gossip unless it's critical intel, mentioned Mark's reputation, always playing both sides. He said, "Can't believe anyone still trusts him." I didn't comment, but I archived the data point. The narrative she was selling that Mark was harmless, that I was threatened, that she was brave, was starting to fray at the edges. The audience wasn't buying it anymore. Meanwhile, my disengagement protocol continued. I stopped sharing my schedule. She noticed. "You didn't tell me you had a late meeting," she said one night, her tone casual. "You didn't submit a query," I replied without malice. The silence that followed stretched for 5 long seconds. She wanted a conflict, a bug to report. I gave her a clean compile. No errors, no warnings. Instead, I spent that night changing the recovery credentials on our shared investment portfolio platform. I wasn't moving assets yet, but I was establishing sole administrative control. The perimeter was being set quietly, legally, logically. She still hadn't asked the right question. Not, why are you being so cold? But, what are you building? She mistook my restraint for weakness, my silence for surrender. She didn't realize her script was failing, and her audience was already looking for the exits. The next time she mentioned a night out, her nonchalance was a tell. Might stay at Mara's place Friday. Movie night, wine. You know. I nodded once. Sounds good. She blinked, thrown off by the lack of resistance. She needed pushback, a bug report, anything to prove her actions had an impact. My quiet compliance was a feature she didn't know how to handle. But I had already prepared for this. That week, I had targeted the one system she thought was entirely hers, but was built on my foundation, a professional networking and content platform. She used it for her consulting work, leveraging my contacts and resources without ever acknowledging the source code. I logged in as the root administrator. I changed her user permissions from admin to guest. I scrubbed her access to the shared contact directory. I restructured the firewalls. Then I ran a test with a dummy login. Confirmed. She was locked out. Friday night came. She left with an overnight bag, playing her game of ambiguity. See you tomorrow. She tossed over her shoulder. I poured a drink and waited. At 11:42 p.m., the first error message arrived. A text. Hey, can't log into the doc archive. Did you change something? I let it sit, unread. At 12:03 a.m., another. Seriously, I need access. We'll talk tomorrow. Still nothing from me, because that's the part she didn't understand yet. Silence wasn't absence. It was a cryptographic key she didn't have. She thought she was staging an act of freedom, a bold declaration of independence. But real freedom has consequences. It means shouldering the weight of burning bridges you didn't even build. While she was watching for an emotional outburst, I was decommissioning servers. She assumed control meant confrontation, but the most permanent changes don't come with loud announcements. They come with a quiet, final message. Access denied. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because the weight was gone, but because I had finally transferred it back to its rightful owner. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The weight hadn't vanished. It had been correctly reassigned. I spent that weekend in complete, productive silence. It wasn't a wounded retreat. It was a system migration. A final transfer of all critical assets to a new, secure server. When she walked in late Saturday afternoon, carrying half a bottle of wine and the faint trace of someplace else on her, I didn't even look up from my screen. She hesitated in the doorway, waiting for the confrontation she thought she deserved, maybe even hoped for. I just kept typing, reviewing the transfer logs, double-checking the timestamps on the new security layers I'd placed around every digital asset we once shared. She lingered, an unauthorized user trying to find a way back into a network that no longer recognized her. The show was over. There was no applause. By Monday, the major groundwork was complete. I had fully partitioned our shared digital infrastructure. Cloud storage, professional resource libraries, joint project management tools all segmented. Most of these were linked to projects we'd started together. Ideas built on my code and her charisma. She had used them as if they were hers alone. I had let that slide for years. Not anymore. There was no passive-aggressive note. I just filed the updates, saved the server logs, and archived everything cleanly. That week, I called my attorney. Not to initiate a divorce, not yet, but to update the dormant file that bore both our names. He offered advice on asset protection and digital forensics. Options always matter. One night, I saw her post a story on social media. A glass of red wine, a disembodied laugh in the background, vague performative content, meant to create mystery and project an image of a life still vibrant. I didn't react. She deleted it within an hour. I logged that too. That same week, I began severing the soft ties, the countless small, interconnected systems that weave a life together. Shared streaming passwords, smart home device permissions, even collaborative music playlists. They seem minor until you realize how much of your daily infrastructure relies on them. She noticed not all at once, but in flickers of system failure. "Hey, I can't find the travel notes from last year," she said casually one evening. "Not sure where those ended up," I replied, eyes on my laptop. I knew exactly where they were, under military-grade encryption in a personal archive she would never touch again. She opened her mouth, then closed it, and walked away. Publicly, the facade held. No loud fights, no status changes. That's how I wanted it. Public messes are easy to dismiss as drama. But a private, systematic withdrawal, the kind that leaves no digital fingerprints, is what makes someone truly understand what they've lost. She had claimed she wanted independence. I gave it to her. Not in words, but in infrastructure. A month after it all began, the annual company rooftop party invitation arrived. The same event, the same venue. I knew she'd be there. I RSVP'd yes. My plan wasn't to cause a scene. It was to close a file, publicly and permanently. I arrived alone. The air was the same. The cheap wine was the same. But I was different. I moved through the crowd with a new sense of gravity. I saw her by the bar, holding a glass of wine, performing for the same circle of friends. She saw me, and her smile tightened just a fraction. She expected me to avoid her, to sulk in a corner. I did the opposite. I walked straight toward her group. With me was Laura, her own friend, the one who had called me weeks ago. Laura's presence was a quiet statement, a shift in alliances that was more powerful than any accusation. My wife's eyes widened slightly as we approached. She tried to recover, her voice a little too bright. "Look who decided to join the party. I was starting to think you'd become a hermit." "No," I said calmly, my voice just loud enough for the group to hear. "I just stopped avoiding necessary maintenance. By the way, I wanted to give you something." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gesture wildly. I simply laid 3 items on the bar between us. First, a high-quality 8x10 printed copy of the photo. The one with her in Mark's hoodie, her face half smiling. The image now crystal clear. The cheap ambiguity of the original post was gone, replaced by stark, undeniable evidence. A murmur went through the group. Second, a neatly printed document. "This isn't as dramatic as it looks," I said. "It's just an itemized list of accounts and platforms you no longer have access to, for your records." The dates and times were precise. No emotion, just documentation. Her face went pale as her eyes scanned the list, the cloud storage, the professional network, the investment portal. Third, I placed the keys to her car on the counter, the one I'd bought for her as an anniversary gift. Attached was the small silver keychain she'd given me years ago. "I believe this is yours," I said. She stared from the photo to the list, to the keys, then back at me. Her voice was a strained whisper. "You're doing this here?" "I'm doing this where it started," I said, my gaze steady. "You wanted an audience when you made your point. It seems only fair you have one for the conclusion." "This isn't fair," she stammered, reaching for an argument. "You didn't even talk to me." "You didn't talk to me when you stayed at his place," I replied, my voice even. "You didn't talk to me when you posted that photo. And you didn't talk to me when you started telling people I was insecure and controlling." Her eyes flickered to Laura, then back to me. It wasn't guilt in her expression. It was the dawning horror of a strategist who has been completely outmaneuvered. She realized, I knew more than she ever imagined. "So, that's it?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You're just walking away?" "No," I said quietly, leaning in just slightly. "I'm repositioning. From a shared platform to a secure standalone server, I'm protecting my assets." I stood up straight. "And you, as of now, are considered a critical security risk." Then I turned to Lara. "Ready to go?" Lara nodded, not even glancing at my wife. "Ready." I walked away, leaving her standing at the bar, surrounded by the silent judgment of the very audience she had tried so hard to win over. She didn't follow. There were no more lines in her script. The show was finally, definitively, over. In the aftermath, she didn't rage. She didn't beg. She just deflated. The fallout from the rooftop party was swift and silent. There were no dramatic phone calls, just a slow, awkward retreat. She had built her entire social persona on being the center of attention, the witty performer. But when the performance is revealed as cruelty, the audience leaves. And they left. The man she'd used as a pawn, Mark, was the first to vanish. No likes, no comments, no stories with her in the background. Gone. I wasn't surprised. As an IT architect, I know that parasites like him thrive on open networks with weak security. When the system owner changes the admin passwords and starts running malware scans, they flee. He slipped out of her life like a bad line of code. In a program she no longer had the credentials to edit. Her inner circle, the ones who had cheered her on with vague slogans about living your truth, they started pulling away too. Not with angry confrontations, but with the quiet social cold front that says, we're not taking sides, but we've already chosen not to stand near yours. I didn't have to leak receipts or whisper behind her back. I just stopped patching her vulnerabilities. I stopped covering for her, and that silence echoed louder than any accusation I could have made. She posted less. When she did, the captions were longer, more reflective. She was trying to pivot, to reclaim the narrative, but the confidence she once weaponized had become hollow. Her glances lingered longer when we passed in the kitchen. Her comments grew quieter. She was recalibrating, searching for the version of me who used to wait, who used to explain, who used to absorb the impact. But that version of me had been deprecated. One night, she sent a text. Just 4 words. We were supposed to. The rest was blank. I let it sit for hours, then replied with the simple truth. You created the system failure. No follow-up. It wasn't cruelty. It was a final error report. She had spent months proving she didn't need the system's administrator. Now she was finally feeling what it was like to have no support. The ripple effects grew heavier. A brand collaboration she'd been nurturing for months quietly fell through. She never told me, but I saw the draft email on her laptop before she could close it. The subject line was polite, corporate, final. We're going in another direction. I knew that direction. I had made a single call weeks earlier, not to interfere, but to correct a factual inaccuracy. She had listed me and my company as a professional reference in her pitch deck. Without my permission, all I did was inform them that this was a legacy connection and no longer active. The bridge she was standing on collapsed under its own weight. She started staying in more, cooking dinner, leaving leftovers labeled in the fridge. Not as a peace offering, but as a placeholder, trying to prove she could still be a functional part of the household. But being useful isn't the same as being trusted. I started taking more meetings outside the house, not to avoid her, but because my network was now entirely my own. You're barely here anymore, she said one night, her voice observational, not accusing. I looked at her. You were the one who wanted an open architecture. This is what it looks like. I hadn't erased her. I had simply stopped building my world around her. The structures she thought were solid had never been hers to lean on in the first place. The request for a final conversation came via text. "Can we talk?" I waited a day, then agreed, setting the location. A quiet, neutral cafe. She arrived first, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I messed this up," she said, her voice low. "I thought I was making a point, that you'd fight for me." "You weren't making a point," I said, keeping my voice even. "You were running a penetration test on our marriage to see what would break." She winced. Did everything break? I thought about the late-night grocery runs, the shared passwords, the easy familiarity. Then I thought about the cold precision with which I had dismantled it all. "You ran the test," I answered, "and it fractured everything it touched." "So there's no way forward," she whispered. It wasn't a question. "There's a way forward," I said. "Just not together." I stood up, put on my jacket, and walked out. The door closed with a quiet click, but for me, it was the sound of a successful system migration. 6 months later, life had a new, quieter rhythm. The divorce was clean, finalized. I was living in my own place, rebuilding my personal network on a foundation of trust. And then, I heard from a business contact that Mark had just landed a major promotion at his company. He was now a vice president, bragging about his talent for disruptive innovation. I didn't get angry. I got curious. As a cybersecurity expert, I know that men like Mark, all charisma and no substance, always leave a trail. They build their careers on flawed, insecure code. I spent 3 hours that Saturday doing a deep dive, not hacking, just meticulous open source intelligence. I cross-referenced his LinkedIn profile with academic archives and old forum posts. And there it was. His master's degree, the one from a prestigious university that was the bedrock of his resume, it was a fake. The university had no record of him. I found the website for the diploma mill that had issued it. I didn't post it online. That would be messy. My revenge is never messy. I wrote a concise, professional, 4-page report, complete with screenshots, links, and a timeline. I created a temporary, anonymous email address and sent the report to 2 people, the head of HR and the chief of internal security at his company. The subject line was simple: potential credential vulnerability for VP Mark. 2 weeks later, a quiet update appeared on his LinkedIn profile. He was no longer a VP. He was exploring new opportunities. Some people build their lives on lies. As an IT architect, I just enjoy debugging corrupt systems. And I never forget what I said. Don't mess with my wife, even my ex-wife, and I'll stay meek.